Good afternoon, all, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And it's not as this setup, you should know, went exceptionally well, and we started probably 30 seconds late. So it's a good way to end our convention, our conference talks. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Robert Bob Galway, Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, and an aviation historian extraordinaire. I've had the great pleasure of meeting Dr. Bob at 3 now CAHS conventions, and little did I know he was a frequent speaker, has been a frequent speaker here when I joined, and here he is again, so many of you will know him. Just a quick bit of biography on him. Bob was born in Kenora, and he grew up as a wild lad in Red Lake, Ontario. He moved on to study at the University of Toronto, UVic, earning a research BA in political science and economy, or political economy, I think the U of T called it in those days, with a minor in geology, which he put to good use over 10 years, first 10 years of his career out working in the field as a prospector, or probably supporting a lot of prospectors. Soon after, he enrolled at the University of Toronto Medical School and graduated there in 1963. He probably studied under the faculty spearheaded by Dr. Grant, and he distinguished himself because he went on for postgraduate medical training in experience that was quite extensive, including, and I should say quite impressively, he did a surgical training program at U of T, then got accepted into McGill University's experimental surgery program. This in an era when the largest two medical schools and the most prestigious were those two schools. He went on to Duncan Teaching Fellowship at U of T's and in connection with Toronto General Hospital, and became a research fellowship, got a research fellowship at McGill's and the Royal Victorian Hospital. All of this leading to his orthopedic surgery specialty, where he practiced for 35 years as an orthopod in Toronto, specializing in knee, shoulder, and reconstructive surgery, so quite impressive, and pediatric prosthetics. On the aviation side of things, Robert, at an early age, got his pilot's license and accumulated 2,500 hours and is an instrument and float-rated pilot. He owned a Cessna Skylane 182 CFZBB, began his training actually on a Stinson Reliant SR9, and has flown Norsemen and Beavers. As an aviation historian, he's been exceptionally active over many, many years, and he's been an intense, enthusiastic historian, and you're going to, for those of you who haven't seen him before, you're going to see this today. He's he's got more than 10 publications and has authored several articles in various places, and he's presented extensively to our national organization as well as various chapters, and has been busy, keeps busy doing other places like Probus. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd love to welcome up to the stage Dr. Bob Galway.
Well, let me start off by saying thank you for coming. This talk today is a bit of a personal journey, and it's turning out to be more of an educational experience than I anticipated when I launched on it a year and a half ago. And Brian, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm not so certain I knew who you were talking about when you started there, but here I am. And my charge today is to share with you the story that I've put under the headline, How Robert Starratt Grew Wings. And this is the story of the Starratt Airway company, a Northern Ontario aviation concern that probably was the biggest of its type at that point in time in history. Now, part of the story is, how did this come about? In 2019 in Montreal, Dick Pickering, the past chairman of the Montreal chapter, got up and gave us the talk on his father's flying career, which started off as a pilot instructor at the Hamilton Flying Club. But in that talk, I learned for the first time that his father had flown his first commercial aircraft in the bush for none other than Bob Starratt from the period 1937 through to 1941. So that was the starting point that led me on. As it turns out, his father flew into my hometown. And here is the lakefront of Mackenzie Island in the Red Lake District in and around that time with Doug Pickering flying in, the last of the super universals that flew in the Canadian skies, AJB, with the Hudson Bay Boast in the background and such. So this is my hometown. It's a bit of a personal story. I gave a enlargement of this print to Dick Pickering 2 years ago in Montreal. It was painted by my next door neighbor and school chum, David Mork, now in Winnipeg, a volunteer at the Winnipeg Museum. And after I gave that picture to Dick Pickering, he voiced his unhappiness that he had never uncovered a full story of Starratt Airways, particularly its relationship to Manitoba, over and above its home base in Hudson, Ontario. And so I said, Dick, I think I'll do something about that. I contacted David, who did the painting at the museum, and said, would you take on the job of putting the story of Starratt Airways together? And he begged off, although he did send me a couple of pictures. And so there I was about a year ago, having made this commitment to Dick, and I'd gotten nowhere with it whatsoever. And last June, Pierre Verhelst, the fellow that looked after the M&R's rotary wing avionics department for 30 years, persuaded me to drive to the AGM in Saskatoon in June. So off we went on a wonderful journey. And I have to tell you, if Donald Trump thinks he can turn this into the 51st state, he's got another thought coming. How many of you realize that Canada is actually 2% bigger than geographic United States? So indeed, if we're going to be the 51st state and we're a bigger country, he's going to add 50 other states to make 51 states to their 50. And who will control the Senate? So he's bitten off something that isn't going to happen. On that trip, we pulled into Ignis, Ontario, halfway between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg. And the reason we pulled in is that living in this small community in Northern Ontario is none other than Gordie Hughes. And Gordie Hughes is Dr. Norseman. And of all the flying Norsemen in the country over the last 20 years, Gordie Hughes in this little place in Round Lake out of Ignis, Ontario, is the fellow that put them back into flying shape. The bottom right is the Norseman on the pedestal in my hometown, Red Lake. The top left is George Green's Norseman in Red Lake, which I flew in 2012. And on the bottom left is C.F. Snow. And day before yesterday, I met the owner of that aircraft. For 30 years, it was Huntsville serving the Muskoka Air Service, and then sold to somebody in Penticton. New prop, new engine, new floats. The guy didn't pay his bill, and it's sitting there rotting in the bush. And this year was the first year that the Norseman Festival in Red Lake has collapsed. There were only 2 Norsemen flying in Canada last year, the end of an era. While there, I said to Gordie Hughes, who's 92, would you know anybody in Northwestern Ontario that could give me some insight into Starratt Airways? And Eleanor spoke up and said, if Gordie can't remember, I know who you need to talk to. You've got to track down and find out if a Ron Bell is still alive. Because Ron Bell is the family historian and married into the Starratt family. Not quite accurate, as I found out, but accurate enough for the purposes. So we're driving down the road and pulling into Tim Hortons in Dryden. And Pierre's phone goes off, and he starts talking, and I hear the name Galway mentioned, the Red Lake Museum, et cetera, and he turns to me and he said, would you rather spend the night in Red Lake where you grew up or in Kenora where you were born? And I said, why? He said, Ron Bell will meet us at 8 o'clock tonight, and he'll come over with the curator of the Red Lake Museum. 15 kilometers down the road, Highway 105, I ended up for the first time in 12 years back in Red Lake, and I met Ron Bell, who happened to be the retired high school principal. And actually, the relationship to the Starratt family was that his sister married Robert Starratt's youngest son, Dean, and there were 7 grandchildren from that marriage. And Ron Bell was the retired high school principal, English major, and he sure lets you know that if you misspell something, says to me, he said, I'm the family historian, I'm the family eulogist. He said, I'm 85, I've run out of steam. If you can do something with this and promise to put it before your own aviation group, and I'm meeting that commitment today, and he said, the Starratt Airways material is yours. And he turned over to me 2 boxes of photographs, and with him was the girl that was at the museum in Red Lake with her own material. So I ended up with these 3 big boxes in Pierre's car on the way to Saskatoon saying, my God, look what's here. What's the pilot list, the mechanics list. And included in that was 3 hours of video, 90 years old and such. So I said, okay, there's my primary source. Let's back that up. I interviewed 2 of the grandsons, Robert and Jay. I talked to David Mork at the museum, who looked up some of the photographs for me, the Red Lake Museum material, and I went through the Toronto Star and the Toronto Globe and Mail, and I got out 60 articles that correlated with the material that I had. And finally, I found out I'd made a mistake. Dick Pickering hadn't complained that there had been nothing ever written about Starratt Airways, quite the contrary. He complained that the Red Lake, the Winnipeg Museum had failed to acknowledge what a contribution it had made to Manitoba aviation. But there indeed was a story in our own journal, 1991, December, and there's the cover from our own institute's journal with an article in it by a fellow named George Shaw, now passed away. And I have to give credit to George Shaw that I'm not the first person that has put this story together for this society. It was published with these photographs in the 1991 journal. And the difference between what he's put out and what I'm putting out is that I'm expanding a little bit of the background holistically, and I've added to it the newspaper material that correlates with the written word and the photograph. And then I did a video course so I could take apart that 3-hour video that had been put together from old 8mm videos and such. So I could share with you that this isn't just the written material and the documentation and the photographs, but here we have 90-year-old footage of Starratt Airways aircraft taxiing out of Hudson to go into the mining communities that they've served. And so embedded in the story today is 3 other clips that you'll find of interest. Now, I'd like to make the observation that the history of commercial aviation pioneer days in Canada is intimately interwoven with the development and history of the mining industry in Canada. If you go to the 14 companies that were allowed to print their own stamps, the era of semi-officials in the era of philatelic world, only one of them had no connection whatsoever to the mining industry, and that was BC Airways. And every other one, even if it included Jack Elliott, who didn't start off with the mining, but ended up being the first aviation company to go into the Red Lake Gold Rush in 1926. They all had an intimate connection to the Canadian mining industry. The difference is in terms of the Red Lake Gold Rush and the other areas, the waterway into Red Lake is narrow, 4 portages, passable by canoes, but not by freight scows and barges, and it was more or less inaccessible. Whereas on Lake of the Woods, the mining industry there, the waters were wide open as they were flying up to Noranda, Horn Bay for the Noranda mine in Rouen, Quebec. So this is the challenge that faced the development of the Howe property discovered 100 years ago this July in Red Lake. An impassable river other than by foot or by, in the wintertime, a dog team, and in the earliest days, actually horsepower, which is something I had not appreciated. So this was the challenge. Okay, Bob Starratt came into this picture in the early 1926 period, and it was from his transportation company that we saw evolve the aviation wing, so to speak, Starratt Airways. Now, who was Robert Wright Starratt? He came from a small little town south of Moncton on the Bay of Fundy coastline called Hopewell Hills. It would mean nothing to most of us in this room, but in fact, it was the hometown of our 11th Prime Minister, R.B. Bennett, which I was not aware of, with one Victoria Cross winner from that. And he was born there in 1887 in Hopewell Hills to parents Charles and Sarah, and a family history that goes to that part of Canada right back into the early 1800 period. His oldest brother went to the United States. His next brother fought at the Western Front and was buried in Belgium with the Canadian Field Artillery. His youngest brother went to Northern Ontario with him to help in the family business there. He went west to Saskatchewan in 1910, working with the railway. His girlfriend, fiance, Iris of the Irving family, joined him in 1913, and they were married in Waukau, Saskatchewan at that time. The railway work ended. He went to work as a freighter for the Hudson Bay Company, and that's where he really developed what was going to be his métier in life from that point on. There was a downturn in the trading business, and he ended up having crossed the country from Manitoba to the Alberta border, ending up back in Winnipeg. He got work for a short period of time in the winter of 1925 and such, and then hired back on as a freighter with the Hudson Bay Company in 1926. The Hudson Bay Company were not particularly interested in large volume transportation. They just wanted the bacon and beans and goods for the fur trade business. He saw that the demand was there for major transportation requirements in northwestern Ontario to develop the Howe mine in Red Lake. And so he quit the Hudson Bay and he joined up with an old prospector and his cousin, the Campbells. George Campbell's the guy that founded Campbell Red Lake Gold Mine, that was the richest gold mine in Canadian history. It became part of Goldcorp, and it's still being mined 100 years later today. And his cousin Colin Campbell, and they formed the Northern Transportation Company, and they were going to not only carry the trade goods into the North Country, the food supplies, the people, but the heavy equipment that would be needed for the building of the processing plants in the Red Lake area. This was the start of the Depression, and Colin Campbell bailed out, leaving Bob Starratt as the sole owner of Northern Transportation Company. And these are some of the demands that were placed upon him and how he met that challenge. The heavy equipment for the mill, the head frame being towed by Colin Campbell himself in the middle picture, the water route into Red Lake. And there were 4 portages on it that had to be overcome by building small marine railways. This, in fact, is where Bob Starratt's métier in this field showed through. He borrowed the money from the Bank of Commerce and put in the marine railways at that time that overcame that particular summertime hurdle. I want you to remember this picture in the top left, because one of the things that Bob Starratt did was befriend and support the church people in the area, free transportation through the North Country. And here we have one of the reverends in that area, a novitiate in the Anglican Church at that time, Reverend Love. This is where my father went to in 1933. The slide is my home in Red Lake, my father and mother at the bottom left, and it was the second mine that was developed in that area and meeting the transportation needs. And this newspaper article, in the fact, at the bottom right is an artifact from my family collection, my father carrying out the first surgical procedure in that part of the country after he had started his mining medical career in the Great Bear Lake earlier that year. So now let me go and talk to you about the commercial aviation activity that arrived out of this. The tractor trains were built in the wintertime. Bob Starratt would not know from 1 hour, let alone one day of the week, what their progress was, whether they broke down, gone through the ice. And he came up with the idea, probably put into his head by Harold Farrington, who was the first guy that flew in for Jack Elliott into Red Lake in March of 1926, that there may be merit in the use of an aircraft to track the progress of the tractor trains as they went up the ice. And so in 1930, he leased from Northwest Aero Marine Company in Winnipeg a Cirrus Moth, one of the two that the Northwest Marine had at that time, and the pilot, none other than Stuart McCrory. Now, Stuart McCrory may be unknown to you, but he was the pilot that's the star of the exhibition of the Royal Aviation Museum in Winnipeg, The Ghost of Charon. He's the fellow that piloted that aircraft. But his first major job was flying the twin aircraft for Bob Starratt, tracking the progress of their tractor trains in the wintertime and ultimately with floats in the summertime. And here is one of the antique maps that shows the approach into Red Lake up through a river system on the English River and a huge lake called Lac Seul, Lonely Lake, which is actually bigger than 3 times the size of Lake Nipissing and such. And the reason that they located the headquarters at Hudson, Ontario, once called Rolling Portage, is that it had direct access to that waterway at Hudson, 15 miles west of Sulikout, which also was a big center, but was not directly on the waterway into Red Lake. So that's how this little place in Hudson became the center of the Starratt Transportation Company, originally called, as I said, the Northern Transportation Company. So the blue route is the route by water and wintertime by ice over the English and Shikuni River system. And at that period of time, Hamill switched his interest in the mining field of Red Lake up to around Osnaburg House, where they discovered the Pickle Crow mine. And so that became the other transportation need that Bob Starratt was serving with his company. And finally, at the end of the 1929-1930 era, they brought in a third mining district called the Uche Lake Mine. And so these were the 3 transportation routes and communities that Bob Starratt was servicing, first by overland and over water transportation, and then ultimately introducing an aircraft to it. And that's how Bob Starratt grew wings. He kept the name Northern Transportation Company until the real Northern Transportation Company in the Northwest Territories basically sued him for using their name. And so he incorporated the company into Starratt Airways and Transportation Company and started to use that name in 1932. And the formal incorporation of that company occurred in 1935. So here we are 90 years later this year, celebrating the formation of the Starratt Airways and Transportation Company. And the town that was centered at became the biggest little town in Canada. You could drive your car 5 miles out of town one way, 5 miles out of town the other way, and that was it. It was really a railway connection and a waterway connection to those 3 very busy mining districts. And so here we have in 1934 in yellow, in addition, they bought 6 airplanes and 5 others on loan. And now you're seeing the real expansion and development of the aviation service of that transportation company, a aviation service that was probably at least the second biggest, if not the biggest of its kind at that point in time in that era. In fact, the only service that was bigger than Bob Starratt Airways was the Interprovincial Air Service at that time, which had no commercial mandate whatsoever. So here we have one of the aircraft landing on the lake at Hudson, Ontario, and that was one of the two Fox Moss that Starratt owned that was brought to his aviation stable by none other than Harold Farrington. That's a 90-year-old image that I've just shown you. What did they transport? Well, obviously there was passengers, people, food supplies, but here is the gold coming out. The manpower going in, the equipment going in, and the gold coming out. That gold was the first brick at the Pickle Crow mine, worth $103,000 at the time, just before gold went to $35 an ounce from 22. At today's price, that gold brick that they flew out would have been worth $9 million. Now, I want to introduce to you the challenge of flying in the North Country. It's governed by two factors, freeze up and break up. When freeze up comes, the flying stops. When break up comes, the flying stops. And those communities can be isolated from anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the ferociousness of the wintertime and the delay in the melt in the springtime. They, in fact, used to take ashes out of the mine to scatter on lines about the size of this room apart to attract the sunlight to try to speed up the breakup by 4 or 5 days. So your flying activities and people's livelihoods as well as their food depended on that particular time of the season. I'm going to skip over that, but these headlines of the paper reinforce how important aviation was to the distant mining communities. And as you know, it was this activity in Red Lake that set the stage for the reversal of aviation fortunes in the whole country. So it became basically known as the busiest airport in the world in 1937, the year I was born, related to the air freight weight that took off and landed from Hudson into Red Lake, as well as the people and the passengers. And so everything was built around this particular schedule and such. And here we are, 1937, showing that the transportation companies had to really implement a big push to move the freight in before the communities got isolated. And look what happened, 1937, 1,700 tons of freight, 6,000 passengers. And by 1939, his company was carrying 3 times the amount of freight and up to 12,600 passengers a year with 10 aircraft flying day in and day out, other than the time that they were grounded because of the conditions on the lake. Their non-commercial activities are also of interest. Bob Starratt not only was known for the air service, but his ground transportation. He developed refrigerated scows to bring in fresh meat into the country. And the biggest thing that has still scarred is in the minds of those people that grew up there, like myself, was that he built scows out of his own pocket to bring the children of Red Lake in 1939, 8 days by water, out to Hudson, over to Sulikout for a visit with the King and Queen of the Commonwealth in 1939. And those children in Red Lake that were a little older than me made history by that particular trip. The daring of the pilots of those days is exemplified by this story. On a mercy trip to bring out a patient, probably that patient was a patient of my father's, who was dying from a ruptured appendix, and he flew in at a height of 100 feet of ground level to accomplish that mercy flight. One of the other children that was brought back was a young 18-month-old child with a dislocated hip, put into a plaster at the Winnipeg Children's Hospital, and Bob Starratt flew that child back in to Red Lake. gratis. And he was a community-minded personality, and I want to emphasize that aspect of his life. And that may be another reason why you can say he wore wings. He took time off to participate in the establishment of the Canadian Air Transport Association in Ottawa. And so this is the recognition by the country as a whole, how important aviation was to the northern reaches of the country, where I had the great privilege to live until I was 18 years of age and came east to go to university. I mentioned the aerophilatelic world and the aviation companies that flew that mail with their own stamps. Bob Starratt's company was not involved in that, but they did have a postal contract with the government of Canada that brought in official airmail in April of 1928 to fly out the central leg to the Uche Lake mines. And an envelope from that period of time, 10 years ago, would have been valued at $250 an item, and probably 3 times that in today's time frame. At the same time, paying attention to the commercial needs, there was also a sightseeing aspect, and Hamill, who was the developer, whose estate in Oakville last year sold for about $14 million. He brought all of his friends from Eastern Ontario, from the stockbroking business, the mining community, and even C.D. Howe to visit his properties throughout northwestern Ontario. And Jack Hamill at that time had just been nominated to be one of the members of the Board of Governors of the Bank of Canada. And so these were VIP flights through Northern Ontario that included big money, big people, and as I've highlighted here, C.D. Howe. And I'll come back to that a little later at the end of my talk. And if I don't, please remind me, John. The other hazard that was faced is not just the weather hazard, but fire. They lost 6 of their aircraft because of fires. The 4 of those were fires under the nose hangars that they had developed to warm the engines in the wintertime with the blow pots underneath them. And 2 of them were fires inside the hangar themselves, where an errant mechanic had lit up with fumes. So fire was a very significant hazard in those days throughout the whole of the North Country. One of the other items that was of interest was I stumbled on the fact that one of the aircraft lost a gold brick overboard in about 60 feet of water. And it happened that there are 2 families in that part of the world that had offspring in the Royal Canadian Navy, trained as naval divers, and one of them was well known to Bob Starratt, the Bernier family, Joe Bernier in particular. His son Leo became Minister of Lands and Forests for the province of Ontario. So they put out the arm, and they basically were able to talk Joe Bernier into coming and diving. And in fact, they actually salvaged that gold brick from 60 feet of water at Lost Lake. And there is So the soundtrack authenticates the video of the aircraft that was found on. Now, let me turn aside. Joe Bernier was quite a storyteller and loved to tell stories, but his son was able to get even with him and tell a story in reverse about Joe. He was called out because one of the tractor trains had gone through the ice, and one of the boxcars had sunk to the bottom with a valuable cargo in it, and he was persuaded to bring his outfit to the Ear Falls area where this had happened, and down he went. And within about 30 seconds of being underwater, the helmet came up through the air, and he ripped his helmet off before his son could disconnect it. And he said, "What the hell have you done to me? There's dead people down there." He said, "There's no damn way I'm going to dive on that." And they all started to laugh. He said, this is no laughing matter. There's dead people down there. And they all started to laugh, say, Joe, those are pig carcasses for the bunkhouse. That particular cargo was a load of meat from the meat packing plant in Winnipeg, and he never lived that joke down. The Starratt Airways had, like all of the northern countries, airline services, the aircraft forced down by snowstorms, rainstorms, bad weather, and such. And finally, they thought there would be a fatality, and sure enough, one of their Fairchilds, the 82, went down, 10 passengers on board, missing for 5 or 7 days, and all hope was given up. And in fact, they actually tramped out of the bush, and there was never a loss of a passenger or an aircraft due to a crash landing in bad weather during the decade-long history of that airline company, except once, and I'll come to that in a second. There were desperate times. In this one instance, one of the mining engineers aboard the plane, I think it is actually George Shaw's father, was in his consulting mining engineer in his Toronto suit, walked out in 25 below zero weather. If you've never lived in the North Country, you do not understand how cold it can be. Red Lake would be 40 below zero weather when I played hockey. 3 weeks ago, the ice in Lac Seul was still 30 inches, and they're ice fishing. I can recall playing hockey outdoors, my earlobe freezing. I bent it up, it cracked, and it stayed there because it was frozen. It's a different world out there, and we have a huge snowstorm going through through North Bay and up into the Labrador that tells the story that we live in two different worlds. This story of this crash has personal interest to Doug Pickering because his father was trying to start early flying after freeze up, and he landed on Lac Seul before the ice was thick, and he went right through the ice because it hadn't developed the strength that it needed. And he spelled out with wood, need food, thin ice, and passed the message off. It just happened that there was a nearby lake, much smaller, froze faster, and they were able to land a moth in it and undertake to salvage that aircraft. The wings kept it up from going to the bottom, and this is photographs that Dick Pickering has shared with me that are in his own archives of that particular incident involving his father. Let me now go to the highlight of the aircraft and the tragedy associated with it for Starratt Airways. This is Beech CF BGY. It was the 5th production Beech D-18 built in Kansas, picked up by Hump Madden and Bud Starratt, Bob Starratt's oldest son, flown on exhibit to New York and then up to Red Lake. The year I was born in 1937. And it's the first Beech that had been put on skis and floats and import into Canada. And here we have it taxiing out of the factory in Kansas City 88 years ago. This clip is of CF-BGY, Canada's first D-18, and they still are flying the two D-18s up out of Red Lake in the tourist fishing business. But the tragedy is that aircraft crashed on my birthday, January the 7th, 1941, killing Bob Starratt's son, Bud, the pilot, and his only passenger, Finnish prospector. And the literature today, still in some quarters, has really irritated the family because it talks about the cause being pilot intoxication. Intoxication, yes. Alcohol, no. The intoxication was because of a leakage from the heating system of carbon monoxide into the cabin. And it was the first tragedy in North American aviation that was finally identified as being due to carbon monoxide poisoning. And that set Bob Starratt off on basically a path throughout the aviation world talking about the hazards of carbon monoxide, and the air services, the United States Air Force and Canada, both ultimately came to recognize that this indeed had been an unrecognized problem before. I won't go into technical reasons of what happened to cause the carbon monoxide leakage into the cabin, but ultimately it was identified and such. And such. And so that happened on my birthday. I was 4 years of age, and I can still remember that aircraft having brought Santa Claus into Mackenzie Island the Christmas before this happened a month later. And it's imprinted on my mind that it was a dark robin's egg blue color to this day. So I'm going to take a quick sip to get rid of the frog in my throat and such. In any event, this aircraft was well known throughout the North Country. It was ultimately put on the Hudson to Kenora to Winnipeg to Lactabonny up to Red Lake and back to Hudson 3 times a week. And at the end of the career of Starratt Airways, he had a significant presence in southeastern Manitoba. I'm going to go back. When they visited the crash site, they found that there was no question that it was a straight-in dive. He collapsed over the control column and it went in nose first. And indeed, they actually found his wristwatch, which was returned to his mother. And years later, the Stelco company started mining iron ore from under Bruce Lake near Ear Falls. And when it was an open pit mine, they started bringing up remains of the B-18 as late as just 10 years ago. This was the end of Starratt Airways. It did not necessarily lead to the closure of the airline. Don't forget now, we're in the early days of World War II, out of the Depression years, and things were evolving in the financial world. And basically, James Richardson had stepped in to the breach, both here in the East, to buy up 8 or 9 of the Bush airline services and Canadian Airways in the East, and amalgamate them under the banner of Canadian Airways that ultimately became turned over to the Canadian Pacific Company and the birth of Canadian Pacific Airlines. The war was on, and the government had stepped in to take a title of one of their Norsemen's. And so Bob Starratt ultimately sold his company out somewhat reluctantly in 1941, and ultimately in 1942, it was reformed with another 8 companies into Canadian Pacific Airlines. So here are the 19 aircraft that they owned in the Starratt stable. That period of time, he was always upgrading his aircraft to the next generation of purpose-built aircraft for air freight operations, passenger services in really tough climates. And the last 2 aircraft he owned was the fastest aircraft in Canada at the time, the Beech 17 Stagger Wing that I showed or mentioned, and the Beech 18. And I've managed to, with the help of 2 or 3 acquaintances in the research group, particularly David Mork and one of the Starratt brothers in Hudson, to find pictures of all 19 of the aircraft that Bob Starratt had owned. And if you add to it the leased Cirrus Moth 2 from Northwestern Aero Marine in 1930 and 1931, flown by Stuart McCrory, that aircraft company had actually leased or owned 20 variants of aircraft. And at the height of their flying, we're flying 16 of them on a daily basis. So here's 5 of the aircraft. You've seen the video of the Fox Moth, the Verse Northman, the Beech 18, the Fairchild 82, the Stagger Wing, the Super Universal, and such. And Bob Starratt was very much a community man. And indeed, he flew the Red Lake hockey team out to the Allen Cup Championships in Canada. because hockey was big in the North Country in those days, and that's where I learned to play my hockey. And on no bragging aside, I had the great opportunity of centering the great Bobby Hull when I played junior hockey. So I learned my hockey at really where hockey was not only popular, almost a disease. Many of the miners actually came in from the NHL at the end of their career to work in the mines, to people in the mines company. I want you to look at one peculiar aspect, and they look at the undercarriage on the Beach 18. When they brought it into Canada and went to put it on skis, the skis that had been made for it were too long. The propellers would have chewed the tips up. And the only way out that very first winter on operations was extend the undercarriage height. And that made it a hell of an aircraft for the nose-up attitude at takeoff. The following year, the Elliott Company in Sulikout that built skis for the whole world, including Admiral Byrd, produced a shorter pair of skis, and the normal attitude of that aircraft on its undercarriage was brought back to normal. And so the dean of the Starratt Airways family, Ron Bell, has communicated across North America and discovered that 4 of those aircraft that I mentioned still exist. The 82 is in the National Museum in Ottawa. The Stagger Wing has been rebuilt and is now somewhere in British Columbia. AGY, their first Moth, not the one that McCrory flew, but the one Harold Farrington flew, is in the Reynolds Museum of Tasquan, Saskatchewan. And the Travel Air is restored, has recently been seen at Oshkosh, and it's in Colorado. This picture is just to display that at the end of the lifetime of Starratt Airways, it was not only still flying into the Howie Mine, Red Lake mining area, bottom left to the fur trade business and the Hudson Bay Post on Lac Seul in that part of northwestern Ontario. They had a base of operations in Kenora. There's the Kenrisha Hotel, the town I was born in. The plaque at the bottom is to recognize the contribution of aviation to Manitoba, particularly in Lac de Bonnie. And indeed, Starratt Airways had an office in the St. Charles Hotel in Winnipeg. So it very much had, at the start of its career and at the end of its existence, a very distinct and strong connection with Manitoba. And the Manitoba chapter has never really recognized that reality about this company. It belonged as much to Manitoba as it did Northwestern Ontario. And indeed, at a period of time in Canadian history, the area I grew up, Northwestern Ontario, was really under the control of the province of Manitoba, taken away from them by the Privy Council and turned over to Ontario in the late 1800s, just a point of Canadian political history. So here we have a company that started off as a transportation company on the waterways into Red Lake by barge and boat, supplied by horsepower, and ultimately acquiring wings and wing power. So there is a history of Starratt Airways. The demand on aviation changed in Red Lake at the end of the war when they finally built the Highway 105 that opened when I was 10 years of age and came in from Dryden up Highway 105. And here we have none other than the Premier of Ontario celebrating and came into Red Lake in 1947 to cut the ribbon. And that dog is my dog, Cappy, an Irish setter, and my father, who was the mine doctor at the time. Now, I want to stress that this was a small bush airline, but not small by their standards. It had employees, over 60 people working full-time and such. And so it was a family-oriented business. Everybody knew everybody. They worshiped together, they played together, they drank together, and they cried together. And that happened on more than one occasion. So they all got together for a reunion, 25th birthday at the Royal Alexandra Hotel in Winnipeg, May 13th, 1967. And Bob Starratt up and died on them just 2 months prior. Nevertheless, they went ahead with that reunion. And his youngest brother, who had worked for the company, said, here is the accomplishments that I think we can really be proudest of. The first twin beach to come into Canada, BGY. The fastest personal passenger aircraft in Canada, BIF, the Staggerwing. They threw 3 tons of freight almost on a daily basis in 1937. They carried gold bullion on one load at one time by my father's friend, W.P. Mackle, the head of the kosher mine, $635,000 worth. At today's $3,300, that load was worth $27 million. No wonder they dove for it. No wonder they dove for it. So at the same time, it was the first company that saw one of the ways to overcome the breakup and freeze up issue was to fly out of a smaller lake. They melted faster and they froze up faster. And it was the only company at that time that flew one aircraft out of the Hudson area on skis and from a small lake nearby on floats in the same day. And so that was one of their accomplishments. But let me, if I can, turn here and read this poem by one of the mechanics. It's a family business. He says, I don't remember anyone that was not a gentleman, anyone who passed the buck. I don't remember anyone who was out for himself ahead of the organization. Nobody watched the clock. If there was a job to be done, it was done. And I don't remember anybody that was ever fired. If they were a rare misfit, they just faded away. And so that was the family and the business and work ethic of those people in this small town, Ontario. And this gathering of all of these people was so important that Stuart Graham indeed attended that memorial. And to confirm that McCrory actually flew for him, who also is in the memorial book. And finally, this was more for Doug Pickering's benefit, or Dick Pickering's benefit. Here is the letter that Doug Pickering's wrote to the members, describing Dick's engagement and his brother's involvement with the Navy. So the personal family traditions extended well beyond the existence of that company. In 2019, when Dick got up and gave his talk on his father, none other than the head of the DOT Aviation Department, Tim Cole, came all the way from British Columbia so he could stand up in the auditorium in Montreal and say to Dick Pickering, your father was the best aviation master and boss that I ever had. And I felt I really had to include that on the list. 24 pilots, and if you go through this, you'll recognize names that were part of the Hall of Fame, the Jake Siegels, the Dale Atkinsons, Frank Berger, who flew the first night patrol over London in World War I with the RAF. That family is still alive. The star is opposite the name of Lou Poulin. His daughter came up to me at the Bush Plane Heritage 100th dinner for the Provincial Air Service to say thank you very much. She was basically able to send me one of the photographs. And the mechanics, and George Shaw actually did his apprenticeship and worked as a AME for Bob Starratt. At the end of his career, Bob Starratt bought property in British Columbia and Alberta. He opened up a lumber mill, and ultimately, after his death, the family donated 600 acres to the province of British Columbia. It's now a cranberry bog and a wildlife preservation area out of Valemount, British Columbia. But let me turn to the final part of my story, and that's the eulogy that was given to the group by the Reverend Love. And he tells the story that he was walking down the street in Florida, many years having been away from Red Lake, and he saw the name Starratt on the porch post. And he said, that name I remember. He went in and he knocked on the door, and a guy came and answered the door, and he said, "Sir," he said, after he asked who you are, he said, "I'm Reverend Love, and can you show me the way to the Howie Mine at Red Lake?" And it was none other than Bob Starratt, 30 years later. And they reminisced, and he remembers Bob Starratt offering him free transportation to visit the prospectors in the outreaches of northwestern Ontario. So he closed with the following: "Lives of great men all remind us we too can make our lives sublime, and on departing leave our footprints in the sands of time." And Bob Starratt left his footprints on the sands of time. Iris lived to 101, and my good friend in Winnipeg, Richardson's historian, John Richthammer, went and visited Iris on her 100th birthday in Kenora, and she shared with him these two mementos that I put up for your interest at the end of this talk. And there's Iris Starratt at age of 100, and these images of Bob Starratt as a youth in Hopewell Hill, New Brunswick, Robert Wright Starratt. So Lon Bell said, "My contribution to your talk, I want to be the one that summarizes it. The formation of the Northern Transportation Company, supplying trade goods by canoes, boats, tugs, and scows. The first oxen and horses in the north, the first tractor train, the development of winter trucking, the development of the scows for the royal visit, a preacher for one of the First Nations people that worked for the company, the first Norseman that came into Canada, AZS, the first Twin Beach you've already heard of, BGY. He transported the hockey teams for nothing, gratis, to the Allen Cup playdowns. He brought in the first fly now, pay later. And if you're a prospector and you come out with $500, $1,500 in your pocket, what's the first thing you do? You buy a beer and you spend it elsewise. What's the last thing you do? You go back to the aviation company and say, "I'm dead broke and I'm hungover. Can you get me back home? And can I pay for it in credit?" And that was why Bob Starratt developed the transport fly now and pay later program. C.D. Howe stepped in and said, "That's anti-competition," and canceled it. But that was something that was continued on sub rosa. He developed search and rescue flights, so much so that with the building of the Alaska Highway, movement of the United States Air Force into Alaska, he was consulted about flying in the North Country. He helped with Wings develop No. 5 Air Observer School in Winnipeg. And with his contacts with C.D. Howe, he became the head of C.D. Howe's $1 a year man in charge of scrap metal and aluminum collection to supply to the aircraft industry and such. So these are the things that I would like you to remember about basically Bob Starratt and his contributions, not just to aviation, but the wider aspect of things. And so there's the story of the Starratt Airways and Transportation Company. I thank you very much for your attention.
Bob and I have a gift for you today. It's a written account of what you saw here today. Going back in history, Bob Galway and I started the Georgian Bay chapter last fall in Barrie, and I'm the president, and Bob Galway is my co-anchor, co-chair. And so we have a written account for you, and you can pick it up at the over here where the books are. That's where I'm going to be handing them out. So pick up your copy of that on the way out. And thank you, Bob. Thank you for being a good friend of Georgian Bay. And turn the mic back to Roger
here. Bob, just actually two quick follow-ups. Which Ontario Premier, I missed the name, is in that picture with your father and the dog?
George Drew.
Ah, okay.
Of interest, George Drew was actually an aviation historian of some note, not just a politician and such, so which is a point of interest.
Okay, yeah, because pre-Bill Davis, I don't know my Ontario premiers. But then also you teased us at one point with there's maybe a little personal sidebar to one of your slides, if there's
Yeah,
time.
I said C.D. Howe, I wanted to come back to that at the end, and I overlooked that. Well, the reality is there's a historical mistake in the literature. If you go to the Royal Aviation Museum's website or the Canadian Bushplane Heritage website, as well as others, they talk about the fact that Bob and Iris, who lived to 101, lived happily ever after in Florida. And that actually is a historical mistake that has not been corrected and has just been perpetuated. And I uncovered that mistake because just by luck, digging, I ran into an American immigration card doing one of my Ancestry.ca searches, as well as the United States Census for 1950. And so this headline, it's outlined in blue, after selling their company, Bob and Iris retired to Florida, where they remained until he passed away in 1967, is not correct. Both the immigration card shows that Evelyn Lorraine McAllister crossing the border at New York on her way to Florida when she changed aircraft, and the United States Census show that actually in 1950 at this time, who was on the list as Bob Starratt's wife is a lady born in Alberta by the name of Ellen Lorraine Starratt, McAllister Starratt, and she was C.D. Howe's secretary. And it's taken a lot of digging since that time to find out that actually there was a divorce in 1940 that went on, and that's when Bob Starratt had entertained C.D. Howe, became a $1 a year man, and ended up divorcing Iris at that point in time and marrying 16 years junior, like Belichick's item in CNN News last night. And this was somewhat of a sad contrast. I once picked up a book on heading to a meeting in Maine, and it's why bright people do stupid things. And almost always that book was one page and the other 90 pages are empty. And one page one said, because of entitlement. You know, bright people do stupid things because over time they get a strong sense of entitlement. And the sad part is that I now realized that when Bud Starratt died in 1941, they'd already been divorced, and Iris had no shoulder to cry on. And I did not put it into my talk, but they also lost their first son at age 15 in Hudson, Ontario, who had been shot in the stomach by a schoolmate and flown by one of the Starratt Airways pilots to the Winnipeg General Hospital, where he succumbed from the gunshot wound to the GI tract. And so of the 4 sons that they had, they lost 2 of them to violent death. One a gunshot wound at age 15, and then Bud Starratt, newly married, only 24 years of age, and such. And Iris, who lived to 101, the rest of her life had not a shoulder to cry on. And that's one of the sad outcomes that I've taken away from that story. Thanks for asking that question.
I'm curious, once Canadian Pacific acquired these companies, what happened either with the operations or the routes or the services that they operated, that Starratt operated in northwestern Ontario during wartime?
I can't give you a direct answer. My impression is that about 5 of those companies continued to operate under the banner of Canadian Airways, East, and Canadian Airways West, and then those operations were melded into Canadian Pacific completely. Others, like the Cherry Red Airways out of Prince Albert, and the other one, the Purple, they just faded away because the demands for services melted away with the mining industries in those particular areas, whether it was the Klondike Airways, Cherry Red. The demand for the services was a function of the mining industry, and if the mining industry faded, they faded away. So of the 9 that formed the Canadian Airways hull that became Canadian Pacific, I think 6 of them survived because the demand was still there by the mining communities that had been developed, or the demand for services to the First Nations community started superseding and adding a new cash flow operation. But particularly in northern Saskatchewan, that disappeared, and indeed the same was true of Klondike and Yukon Airways. Okay, so it's a good question. I'll see what I can do to do it for each of the 9 that was taken over. But a very interesting question to follow up.
Bob, you mentioned that the Red Lake Norseman Festival is certainly in an uncertain place at this particular time, which is certainly a concern.
I only had a chance to participate or visit Red Lake in 2012, at which time there were 7 Norsemen still flying. In 2014, they were down to 5, and then they were down to 3 by 1919. The Department of Transport was really starting to superimpose the regulations. I know Gordie Hughes had 2 in Ignis that he wanted to fly to Red Lake. For whatever reason, they put 100-mile restrictions on him flying. The fellow that owned FOX had not paid his bill. They wouldn't give it a temporary flight certificate. So last year, after COVID, it just collapsed, which is really, they still have the street dance, they still try to carry on, but the answer is it's no longer part of Canadian aviation history. Just to finally close this off, is that 2 of the sons joined the Canadian Navy in World War II. Dean and Don came back to Sulakaut, and they went into the tourist business with houseboats and fishing, and they formed their own Starratt Airways. And the only aircraft the Winnipeg Museum had on file they thought was a Starratt Airways aircraft was up at your top left that Bill Zuck sent me. And in fact, that was never owned by Bob Starratt Airways. That was one of the first 2 aircraft that the Starratt brothers had to service their fishing needs. And the other one is the Found Aviation aircraft on the top right. And that's still flying, as a matter of fact. They sold that business to a fellow by the name of Tut Hope, and that aircraft is still supplying the needs of the family who, Robert Starratt Jr., he continues to live with his family running that operation out of Hudson. The other brother, Jay, is now in Calgary. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, just Center Island. They belong to Royal Canadian Legion number 139. Barry's 146. And I talked to the people in Barrie. Those legions are closing one by one. They're going to soon be the thing of the past. There's only 20 members of the Legion in Hudson. And every year, those people get on at Easter time a skadoos because they've put around the margins of Lac Seul these stone cairns to all the people from that part of northwestern Ontario that died in World War I, World War II. And there's 14 of these cairns that they service every year out of the Legion number 139. And this is a picture of the name Mellish, who was a fellow that worked for me, that was sent to me as a result of this year's Easter patrol by Skidoo, 100-mile out and 100-mile back. And so the smallest little town in Canada still does great things.
So thank you, Robert, for not only giving us the Starratt story, but also a fascinating insight into the way of life at that time in that part of the world. Now, Robert has told us he's already, I use the word field tested, 5 more presentations, and he's also volunteered 2 of them to future chapter presentations. So when you think about it, we sometimes have a struggle getting presenters, and here we have Robert offering 2, and how can we turn that kind of offer down? So once again, Robert, thank you very much.
Okay, Eric, thank you.